My name is Jim Hoobler, and I want to welcome you to the Downtown Presbyterian Church. This is the third Presbyterian church building to stand on this corner. The first one went up in 1816, but Presbyterians have been here almost since the beginning of Nashville. In fact, most of the early settlers were Scots-Irish, so their ancestry religiously was Presbyterian. And as early as 1785, Thomas Craighead was here working with the Presbyterians in the Nashville community. The first building that was put up was done in 1816, 2 years after the congregation organized down on the public square in the Davidson County Courthouse. They bought the corner here at 5th and Church and put up a structure. And in that building, or actually on its front steps, Andrew Jackson was presented by the state of Tennessee with a ceremonial sword for his defeat of the British at the Battle of New Orleans. That building unfortunately burned in 1832, so they rebuilt. And in the second building, Sam Houston married his first wife, Adelicia Hayes, became Adelicia Franklin, and then later Acklin, and then later Cheatham. And also, in that building, James K. Polk was sworn in by the state of Tennessee as the governor of Tennessee. That building too burned in 1848. By that time, however, William Strickland, one of the leading architects in America, had come to Tennessee to design the first and only Tennessee State Capitol building. And while he was working here, he was approached by the Presbyterian congregation to enter a competition and design a structure for their new building. His initial proposal was a structure that was Italianate. They didn't like it, so he went back to the drawing boards and came up with something even more bizarre, an Egyptian building. And they took it. I think the reason they did was one of the members was, as I mentioned earlier, Adelicia Franklin Acklin. She was the wealthiest woman in the state, and when her husband died, Mr. Franklin, she commissioned another architect in town, Adolphus Hyman, to do an Egyptian revival burial mausoleum. It had, like in this building, if you look behind me over the doorways, you'll see Amun-Ra, the sun god of ancient Egypt, flying in the cornices up there. Well, her mausoleum also had Amun-Ra flying over the doorway. So I'm thinking that if the wealthiest woman in the state is telling you, I don't have a problem with Egyptian, do you? You'd probably go ahead and do something in that vein. It also was a very popular style at some level in America. In the 19th century, Romanticism was predominant as sort of a philosophical movement in the early 19th century, and architecture reflected that. Egyptian revival was one of those modes that they used, like Greek revival, Gothic revival, Moorish revival, and this building is a National Historic Landmark because it's such a fabulous example of that. In fact, in the 1980s, the Chamber of Commerce had me meet both of Egypt's ambassadors here to the UN and the United States. And when they walked in, one of them, his jaw dropped open and he said, "We don't even do this in Egypt anymore." And I explained to him, well, America hasn't done it in a long time either. However, in the 1980s, when one of the banks here was designing a new building, they knew that the national landmark across the street was in the Egyptian style. So the New York firm of Cohn, Paterson, and Fox designed their building's lower floors in that style as a tribute to this building. The building has had an interesting history with the congregations that have been in it. It was seized by the United States government during the Civil War. All of the pews were taken out, and it was used as a hospital for most of the duration of the Civil War. Following that, it was used as a site for meetings. The Women's Christian Temperance Union met in here, and some groups that were working with the impoverished also met in the church, which is sort of a forerunner of what we do today with the feeding of the people who are homeless. One of the first people that did that was Martha O'Brien, and her center is still going strong in East Nashville. Another one of the missions of the church early on was to found the Sunday school movement in Nashville. And the Attorney General of the United States' wife, Anne Phillips Rogers Grundy, was one of those founders. And she, Mr. Ament from the Methodist Church, McHenry, and First Baptist Church, one of their members, cooperated and formed the first Sunday school in Nashville. Following the 1927 huge flood on the Mississippi River system, flood victims were fed here in the church. In World War II, when they were doing some of the D-Day maneuvers, they didn't know they were getting ready to invade Europe, but they did troop maneuvers here in Middle Tennessee. There were so many troops in Nashville that they were out of bed, so there's a picture of GIs sleeping down in the chapel on the piano, under the piano, all over the floor in the pews. It's had quite a history of mission and commitment to the city. One of the things that they did in the 1970s was we formed a urban ministry with the Presbyterian, brought Pat McGahee in here to deal with impoverishment in the city, and particularly with the rising incidence of homelessness. And that mission has been going on since then. Saturday mornings, we feed homeless people from the church here to the present day, so for several decades now. Pat also was instrumental in founding Project Return, which helped to fight recidivism, or people returning to prisons after they were let out of the penitentiary. Over the years, as you can imagine, a building that's over 150 years old needs some touch-ups. And in 1937, one of the elders was walking down the passageway to the east, and a piece of coping fell off the building and almost hit him. So they decided to do an architectural and engineering survey. They found that the towers were becoming unstable, so they took all of the brickwork down to almost the base. They rebuilt the towers. They put in reinforcing concrete for where the 2-ton bell is in the west tower. And they repainted the interior. They also put a new roof on the building, and they upgraded some of the heating systems. Well, you can imagine if they did that in the 1930s, by the time First Presbyterian left here in 1955, it was time for another tune-up. And in the early 1960s, they put in a new HVAC system. They worked on the roof. They did some painting in the building, and they totally renovated the bottom 2 floors of the education building at the back. That building's interesting because Dr. Vance had that built between 1917 and 19, and the top floor of it is where the Board of World Missions for the Southern Presbyterian Church sent all of their missionaries to Asia, Africa, and Latin America for many decades. This building then, by the 1990s, was in need of a little tune-up, and Ridley Wills and I put together a project to renovate the building. And in time for the 150th anniversary of worshiping in this space in 2001, we did paint analysis on all of the walls in the sanctuary, the narthex, and fellowship hall. And we restored the paint on the ceiling. And on the ceiling alone, there are 16 different colors simultaneously used up there. And it's simulating the desert sky in Egypt. And as you come in through the pylon entrances at the back of the church and you proceed down the aisles, you're facing a hypostyle, or great hall of columns, like at Karnak, one of the chief cult centers for the sun god of Egypt. And as you walk like an Egyptian down the aisles here, you're approaching Karnak. And this is just a remarkable place for a Christian church with all of these symbols in it. And Victorians got around that simply because it was decoration. It had nothing to do with their belief systems. Like Christopher Wren used Roman architecture and the law court as Roman law court as his basic formula. That had nothing to do with Christianity either. It's just pretty architecture. Same thing here, but this is definitely much more colorful than most of the Roman architecture that we look at today. There are 10 major stained glass windows in the sanctuary building. There are 8 that you can see from inside the sanctuary, which are mirror images of each other as they go back. And you're looking at the Egyptian desert sand, sky, and some palm trees with geometrical shapes in them. There are also some roundels in it with pressed glass flowers that are 3-dimensional. There are spherical green glass balls that are in the leaves to the papyrus blossoms that are in some of the windows. And on the exterior, on the Fifth Avenue side, there were 2 additional windows, one in the bell tower and one in what had been the session room. Those are merely geometrical. They do not have any pictures in them. In 1894, Mrs. John W. Thomas, the wife of the president of the NC and St. L Railroad, decided that with the centennial celebration coming up, we might get some more visitors, so let's pretty the place up. So she had them knock 2 holes in the front wall of the church back in the balcony, so 2 new stained glass windows could be inserted up there. She also ordered opera chairs for the balcony. They are laminated wood folding chairs that are bolted to the floor. And on the back there is a coat rack, and under the seat is a hat rack. So a man with a stovepipe hat could slip his brim in there and not block somebody behind him from seeing the performance or the sermon downstairs. On the outside, on the front, originally there were no columns. There were piers there to support them. There was no entablature across the top to tie in the pediment and the frieze up there. And that's because when the church built this in 1851, they overbuilt and they under-budgeted. They had 357 members, and they built a space to seat 1,200 people. So they ran out of money, and they moved into an unfinished building. The ceiling was just sort of roughed in, which produced a bad echo. The windows in the days before we had light bulbs was relying on natural light. So they had clear glass windows to bring in lots of daylight. And in a space, if you look around, there's no fireplace in here, which would have been the heating source in that period. This was totally unheated in the winter. So they had inside shutters on the windows so you could close out cold drafts as well. By the 1880s, they had enough people and enough money, a generation after they moved in, to finally undertake the decoration. And they used Theo Knock and John Schleicher, 2 German decorators and artists working in Nashville. And they had good precedent with Egyptian archaeology by that point, so they did a great job in replicating some of the patterns and color schemes of ancient Egypt. The columns were installed in 1871, and that finished the exterior of the building. As you look at the front of the church, or the facade, you notice 2 square-based towers that go up into another square base and then an octagonal shape, and then it's crenellated at the top. William Strickland was trying to use classical precedent for the towers, and he was modeling them on what he thought the Lighthouse of Alexandria might have looked like. But he put 2 of them on it because that was one of the formulas that he liked to use. He'd done it in Philadelphia on several churches, and his initial proposal here with the Italianate building also had twin towers. This one, though, because of the shape at the top, the octagon and the crenellation, reminded Nashvillians of something they could see every time they walked down Broadway towards the river, the twin funnels of the smokestacks of the steamboats tied up at the wharf at the foot of Broadway. So a nickname that was given to the church was Bill Strickland's Steamboat. Adelicia Ackland donated the bell in the church before her 3rd and final marriage in 1867. It's a 2-ton bell, and it still hangs in the northwest tower of the church. It was the city fire alarm system for about 24 years in the late 19th century, and it was hooked up electronically to the fire headquarters so that it could be rung to alert the city and the firefighters that there was a fire that they needed to come and respond to. The organ of the church was installed in 1913, and it has 2,100 pipes. It has an antiphonal system, which means extra pipes that are in the back of the sanctuary. So as you're playing it from the console, you hear music coming from behind you. It also has a chime system of bells that are with the main rank of the organ pipes. It was done by the Austin Organ Company of Connecticut, and they were the only organ company that made an bellows, or the lungs of the organ, so large that you can actually stand up and walk around in the air chamber of the organ. The current congregation goes back to 1955, when First Presbyterian relocated to Oak Hill, Tennessee, just south of Nashville. And since that time, the membership has been focused on fulfilling Dr. Vance's vision for we are a downtown church. This is where your belief system meets the needs of the community. He talked about he wanted to be a church where someone falling under a heavy burden could find relief, a place that would help the poor, in a place where those in need could find a home and help. And this church has been doing that since the 1950s, particularly since the tenure of Pat McGahey beginning in the late 1970s. And homeless people noticed that when he was having a Wednesday luncheon prayer service, hey, there was food there. Can we have some? So they started coming in and getting meals, and that shifted the whole template. There was a prayer service for the business people and then also a luncheon for the homeless that would go on here in the church. Presently, it's a breakfast that is on Saturdays. With the COVID situation, we have decided that it's easier to do that outside, and we hand out lunches that they can use later in the day at breakfast time. We also have an artist program. The third floor in the back, since the 1980s, has had an artist in residence program where Tennessee artists, Nashville artists, can get essentially free studio space, and we have been rotating artists in and out of there for several decades. We also have what we call AIR, Artist in Residence Program, and we've had composers here. There is a singer-songwriter who is also going to be using some of our space in the next coming months. And she is from Ireland, so I've heard some of her music online, and I'm really looking forward to her sharing this space with us. So a lot of things have gone on here, but this building is quite a tribute to perseverance and to the belief that Nashville is a place that is encompassing and welcoming for all people.